The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of snow and danger. Dorothy Sanders pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine tree, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the three men circle closer. Their voices carried on the bitter air, crude laughter, mixing with threats that made her blood run cold. "Come on out, girl," called the leader, his tobacco-stained teeth gleaming in the pale moonlight. "We ain't gonna hurt you much." Dorothy's fingers trembled as she clutched the torn fabric of her dress, the same blue cotton she had worn to the church social just hours before. Hours that felt like a lifetime ago. Her father's debts had finally caught up with them all, and these men had come collecting in the worst possible way. When she had refused their vile proposition, they had chased her into the wilderness, far from the safety of town. The crunch of boots on frozen leaves grew closer. Dorothy squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God who seemed to have forgotten her existence entirely. Her mother was gone, her father had drunk himself into an early grave, and now she faced a fate worse than death at the hands of these predators. Then she heard it. A low, rumbling voice that seemed to emanate from the very mountains themselves. "I suggest you gentlemen find your way back to town." Dorothy's eyes snapped open. Through the darkness, she could make out a massive silhouette standing between her and her pursuers. The man was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the stars themselves. His long, dark hair fell past his shoulders, and even in the dim light, she could see the wild, untamed beard that covered half his face. Thomas Roberts, the mountain man, the hermit that mothers used to frighten their children with stories about. The man no decent woman would ever consider for marriage. "This ain't your business, Roberts," snarled the leader of the group. "Girl owes us, and we aim to collect." "She owes you nothing," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And you're trespassing on my land." One of the men laughed nervously. "Your land? This here's open territory." "Not anymore." Thomas stepped forward, and Dorothy could see the rifle cradled easily in his massive hands. "You have 30 seconds to disappear, or I start shooting. And I never miss." The men exchanged glances, their bravado crumbling in the face of Thomas's quiet menace. They had heard the stories too. Thomas Roberts was not a man to be trifled with. After a moment of tense silence, they backed away, muttering curses and threats under their breath before disappearing into the darkness. Dorothy remained frozen against the tree, unsure whether she had been saved or simply traded one danger for another. Every story she had ever heard about the mountain man painted him as a savage, a beast who lived alone in the wilderness because civilized society had rejected him. Thomas turned toward her, and she caught her first clear glimpse of his face in the moonlight. Beneath the wild hair and beard, his eyes were surprisingly gentle, a deep brown that reminded her of warm honey. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. "You're safe now, miss. They won't be back tonight." Dorothy tried to speak, but only a small sob escaped her lips. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave, and she felt her knees give way. Thomas moved with surprising speed for such a large man, catching her before she could fall. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "You've had quite a shock." As he helped her to her feet, Dorothy became aware of something that contradicted everything she had been told about the mountain man. His touch was incredibly gentle, his hands supporting her with the same care one might show a wounded bird. There was no threat in his manner, no predatory gleam in his eyes, only concern and a deep, abiding kindness that seemed to radiate from his very being. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and give this video some hype to help it reach more people who might need to hear this story of unexpected love and redemption. 3 months earlier, Dorothy Sanders had stood in the parlor of her family's modest home, staring at the stack of unpaid bills that covered the small wooden table like autumn leaves. Each piece of paper represented another failure, another broken promise, another step closer to complete ruin. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks, and the vultures were already circling. "Miss Sanders," said the banker, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with the air of a man delivering a death sentence. "I'm afraid the situation is quite dire. Your father's gambling debts alone exceed the value of this property by a considerable margin." Dorothy's hands trembled as she picked up one of the bills. $50 owed to the general store, 30 to the blacksmith, 120 to a man whose name she didn't recognize, for reasons that made her stomach turn when she imagined what they might be. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "2 weeks, perhaps 3 if we're generous. After that?" The banker shrugged, his meaning clear. Dorothy would be homeless, penniless, and completely at the mercy of a world that showed precious little mercy to women in her position. After the banker left, Dorothy sank into her mother's old rocking chair and allowed herself the luxury of tears. She had always known this day might come. Her father's drinking had grown worse after her mother's death, and with it, his gambling. She had tried to manage the household finances, but there was only so much a woman could do when the man of the house was determined to destroy everything they had built. The next few days passed in a blur of desperate activity. Dorothy sold everything of value in the house, from her mother's china to her father's pocket watch. She took in washing and mending, working her fingers raw in an attempt to earn enough money to make even the smallest dent in the mountain of debt that threatened to bury her. It was during this time that she first heard the whispers about Thomas Roberts. "That mountain man's got more money than he knows what to do with," said Mrs. Helen Davis as she picked up her freshly laundered sheets. "Lives up there all alone in that cabin, comes to town maybe twice a year for supplies. Pays in gold, he does." "Gold?" Dorothy's ears perked up despite herself. "Oh yes, dear. Found himself a vein up there in the mountains, or so they say. Course no decent woman would ever consider." Mrs. Davis trailed off, realizing the implications of what she was saying. That night, Dorothy lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with possibilities she was ashamed to even consider. She had heard the stories about Thomas Roberts all her life, how he had come to their small mountain town 15 years ago, a broken man running from some terrible tragedy, how he had built himself a cabin high up in the peaks and lived there like a hermit, emerging only when necessity demanded it. The women of the town spoke of him in hushed, frightened tones. They said he was huge and wild, more beast than man. They said he had killed men with his bare hands, that he was dangerous and unpredictable. Some even whispered that he wasn't entirely human, that there was something supernatural about his strength and his ability to survive alone in the harsh mountain wilderness. But Mrs. Davis had mentioned gold, and Dorothy was running out of options. The church social had been Dorothy's last attempt at finding a respectable solution to her problems. She had worn her best dress, the blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, and had smiled until her face ached as she endured the pitying looks and whispered conversations of the other townspeople. "Poor Dorothy," she heard Mrs. Andrea Myers say to her companion. "Such a shame about her father's debts." Of course, at her age, her prospects for marriage are rather limited. Dorothy was 23, which in their small town was practically considered an old maid. The eligible men her age had long since married or moved away to seek their fortunes in bigger cities. Those who remained showed little interest in taking on a wife who came with a mountain of debt and no dowry to speak of. She had hoped that perhaps one of the older widowers might take pity on her situation, but as the evening wore on, it became clear that even they were unwilling to saddle themselves with her father's financial disasters. By the time the social ended, Dorothy felt more alone and desperate than ever. It was as she was walking home through the darkened streets that the 3 men had approached her. She recognized them as associates of Jake Morrison, one of the men her father had owed money to. Their proposition had been as vile as it was clear: work off her father's debt in their establishment or face the consequences. When Dorothy had refused and tried to run, they had given chase, driving her farther and farther from town until she found herself lost in the wilderness, with nowhere to go and no one to help her, except for Thomas Roberts. Now, as she sat by the fire in his cabin, wrapped in a warm quilt and sipping hot coffee from a tin cup, Dorothy found herself studying the man who had saved her life. Everything she had been told about him was both true and completely wrong. Yes, he was enormous. His presence filled the small cabin like a force of nature. Yes, he was wild-looking, with hair and beard that clearly hadn't seen scissors in years. But the stories had failed to mention the gentleness in his movements, the careful way he tended the fire so it wouldn't smoke too much, the quiet respect with which he had offered her his own bed while he slept on the floor. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly, noticing her scrutiny. "I'll take you back to town in the morning." "I can't go back," Dorothy said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I have nothing to go back to." Thomas looked up from the fire, his brown eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Everyone has something. Not me. Dorothy set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. My father left me with nothing but debts I can't pay. The bank is taking the house. Those men tonight, they were just the beginning. There will be others. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. I came here 15 years ago, he said finally, running from something I couldn't face. Lost my wife and daughter in a fire back in Colorado. House went up while I was away working the mines. When I got back. He paused, his massive shoulders tense with old grief. There was nothing left but ashes. 5. Dorothy felt her heart clench with sympathy. I'm so sorry. Blamed myself. Still do some days. Figured I didn't deserve to be around decent folks anymore, so I came here. Built this place with my own hands. Found that gold vein Mrs. Davis probably told you about. Been living alone ever since. Don't you get lonely? Thomas turned from the window, and Dorothy was surprised to see a small, sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth beneath his beard. Every day, he admitted. But loneliness seemed like a fitting punishment for a man who failed to protect what mattered most. The next morning brought a fresh snowfall that blanketed the mountains in pristine white. Dorothy woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing, luxuries she hadn't been able to afford in weeks. She found Thomas at the stove, his massive frame somehow graceful as he tended to the simple meal. Storm's moving in, he said without turning around. Won't be safe to travel for a few days. Dorothy moved to the window and peered out at the swirling snow. Even she could see that the weather was too dangerous for the trek back to town. She was stranded here with the mountain man, and strangely, she felt safer than she had in months. Over the next 3 days, as the storm raged outside, Dorothy began to see Thomas Roberts for who he truly was. Beneath the wild exterior was a man of surprising intelligence and depth. His cabin was filled with books, everything from Shakespeare to treatises on geology and mining. He spoke several languages and could discuss philosophy as easily as he could track a deer through the forest. More importantly, she began to understand the true nature of his gentleness. It wasn't weakness or simple kindness, but rather the carefully controlled strength of a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do and chose not to. When he handed her a cup of coffee, his massive hands were so careful not to brush against hers that she realized he was terrified of making her uncomfortable. You're not what people say you are, Dorothy said on the third evening as they sat by the fire. Thomas looked up from the book he was reading, a volume of poetry that seemed almost comically small in his enormous hands. What do people say? That you're dangerous, wild, that no decent woman would ever. She trailed off, embarrassed. That no decent woman would ever consider me for a husband? Thomas finished, his voice carefully neutral. They're probably right. Are they? Dorothy found herself asking. Because from where I'm sitting, you seem like the most decent man I've ever met. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a vulnerability that made Dorothy's heart skip a beat. For a moment, she saw past the beard and the wild hair to the man underneath, and what she saw took her breath away. Dorothy, he said softly, and the way he spoke her name made something warm unfurl in her chest. You don't know what you're saying, don't I? She set down her own book and turned to face him fully. You saved my life. You've given me shelter, food, warmth, and asked for nothing in return. You've treated me with more respect and kindness than any man in town ever has. So tell me, Thomas Roberts, what exactly makes you so unsuitable? Thomas was quiet for so long that Dorothy began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'm not the kind of man a woman like you should settle for. You deserve someone who can give you a proper life in town, with neighbors and society and all the things a lady should have. And what if I don't want those things? Dorothy asked, surprised by her own boldness. What if what I want is a man who reads poetry by firelight and makes coffee that doesn't taste like mud and looks at me like I'm something precious instead of something to be used? The book slipped from Thomas's hands and hit the floor with a soft thud. He stared at Dorothy as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. You don't mean that. I do mean it. Dorothy rose from her chair and moved closer to the fire, closer to him. I've been thinking about it for 3 days now, about what Mrs. Davis said about you having gold, about the proposition those men made to me, about all the ways a woman in my position is supposed to solve her problems. Dorothy, don't. But here's the thing, Thomas. I don't want to solve my problems by selling myself to the highest bidder or by marrying some man who sees me as a burden to be tolerated. I want to solve them by choosing something different, something real. Thomas stood abruptly, his massive frame casting long shadows on the cabin walls. He moved to the window again, his favorite refuge when conversations became too intense. You're talking about marriage, he said, his back to her. I'm talking about partnership, Dorothy corrected. I'm talking about two people who have both been hurt by life finding something good together. You barely know me. I know enough. Dorothy moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I know you're gentle, despite your size. I know you're intelligent, despite what people think. I know you're lonely, despite choosing solitude. And I know you're a good man, despite whatever you think you've done wrong. Thomas turned to look at her, and Dorothy was startled by the raw pain in his eyes. I failed them, he whispered. My wife. My little girl. I was supposed to protect them, and I wasn't there when they needed me most. That doesn't make you a bad man, Thomas. That makes you a man who loved deeply and lost everything. There's a difference, is there? His voice was bitter. Because some nights I lie awake, wondering if they'd still be alive if I'd been a different kind of man. A better man. Dorothy reached out without thinking, her small hand covering his massive one where it rested on the windowsill. She felt him tense at the contact, but he didn't pull away. You can't live your whole life punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault, she said softly. And you can't honor their memory by throwing away any chance at happiness you might have left. What are you asking of me, Dorothy? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'm asking you to consider that maybe we could help each other. You're lonely, and I'm alone. You have the means to pay off my father's debts, and I have. She paused, suddenly uncertain. What do you have? Thomas asked, his voice gentler now. I have a heart that's still capable of love, despite everything that's happened. I have hands that can cook and clean and mend. I have a mind that enjoys books and conversation. I have. She met his eyes directly. I have the ability to see past the stories people tell to the truth underneath. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. And what truth do you see when you look at me? I see a man who has convinced himself he doesn't deserve love because he's afraid of losing it again. I see someone who has built walls so high that he's forgotten what it feels like to let someone in. But mostly I see someone who still has so much love to give, if he could just find the courage to try again. Thomas's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. The gesture was so tender, so full of longing, that Dorothy felt tears spring to her eyes. You're asking me to risk everything, he said. I'm asking you to risk everything for the chance at something real, she corrected. And I'm willing to do the same. What if I hurt you? What if I'm not the man you think I am? What if you are? Dorothy countered. What if we're both exactly what the other needs and we're too scared to find out? The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if the very mountains were holding their breath, waiting for Thomas's answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft, Dorothy had to strain to hear it. I don't know how to be a husband anymore. I don't know how to share my life with someone. Then we'll learn together, Dorothy said, one day at a time. The morning the storm cleared, Thomas didn't immediately prepare for the journey back to town as Dorothy had expected. Instead, he spent a long time standing on his porch, looking out at the snow-covered peaks with an expression she couldn't read. Having second thoughts? Dorothy asked, joining him in the crisp morning air. Every minute, Thomas admitted, but not about you. About whether I have the right to ask you to share this life. Dorothy looked around at the breathtaking vista that surrounded his cabin. The mountains rose like cathedral spires against the brilliant blue sky, and the silence was so complete it felt sacred. It's beautiful here, she said. It's isolated, harsh. The nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, and in winter we might not see another soul for months at a time. Would that bother you? Having me here all that time? Thomas turned to look at her, and Dorothy saw something shift in his expression. The careful distance he had been maintaining seemed to crack, revealing the longing underneath. No, he said simply. It wouldn't bother me at all. They made the journey to town that afternoon. Thomas leading the way on snowshoes he had crafted himself, Dorothy following in his tracks. She marveled at how sure-footed he was in the wilderness, how he seemed to read the landscape like a book, knowing exactly where the safe paths lay and where danger might lurk. When they reached the edge of town, Thomas stopped. "Are you certain about this?" he asked one final time. "Once we go to the banker, once we pay off those debts, there's no going back. You'll be bound to me, and I to you." Dorothy looked at the town, spread out below them, at the small houses and narrow streets that had never felt like home. Then she looked at Thomas, at this gentle giant who had saved her life and offered her something she had never dared to hope for. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. The banker's reaction when Thomas Roberts walked into his office was everything Dorothy had hoped for and more. The man's eyes went wide with shock, then narrowed with calculation, as he took in Thomas's imposing presence and the heavy leather pouch he placed on the desk. "Mr. Roberts," the banker stammered, "this is unexpected." "I understand Miss Sanders has some debts that need settling," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. "Well, yes, but I hardly think." "How much?" The banker's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Dorothy had to bite her lip to keep from smiling at his obvious discomfort. "The total amount is $437, the banker finally managed. Thomas opened the pouch and began counting out gold coins, each one hitting the desk with a solid clink that seemed to echo in the small office. Dorothy watched the banker's eyes grow wider with each coin. "There's 500, Thomas said when he finished counting. "The extra is for any inconvenience." "Mr. Roberts, I must ask, what is your interest in Miss Sanders' affairs?" Thomas straightened to his full height, and Dorothy felt a thrill of pride at the way the banker instinctively shrank back in his chair. "Miss Sanders has agreed to become my wife," Thomas said simply. "Her debts are now my concern." In Hassan, the news spread through town like wildfire. By evening, Dorothy found herself the subject of whispered conversations and shocked stares wherever she went. Some people looked at her with pity, as if she had made a deal with the devil himself. Others seemed almost envious, perhaps calculating the value of Thomas's gold against the supposed horror of being married to the mountain man. Dorothy found she didn't care about any of it. For the first time in months, she felt truly free. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the small church with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Dorothy wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, while Thomas had somehow managed to find a suit that accommodated his massive build. He had also trimmed his beard and tied back his hair, and Dorothy was struck by how handsome he looked when the wild tangle was tamed. As they stood before the altar, Dorothy couldn't help but think about how different this was from the wedding she had once imagined for herself. She had always pictured a grand celebration with all the town in attendance, a beautiful dress, flowers, music, dancing. Instead, she was marrying a man she had known for less than a week, in a ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a romantic union. But when Thomas took her hands in his and spoke his vows, his voice rough with emotion, Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest. This might not be the fairy tale wedding of her girlish dreams, but it was real in a way that those dreams had never been. "I promise to protect you," Thomas said, his brown eyes locked on hers. "To provide for you, to honor you, and to never give you cause to regret this choice." When it was Dorothy's turn, she found herself departing from the traditional words. "I promise to see you as you truly are," she said softly. "To stand beside you, not behind you, to bring light to your darkness and to let you shelter me from mine." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Thomas bent to kiss her, Dorothy felt a spark of something that might, in time, grow into love. They spent their wedding night in the town's small hotel, a concession to propriety that Dorothy appreciated. Thomas was achingly careful with her, treating her like spun glass as he helped her out of her wedding dress. When she shivered in the cool night air, he immediately wrapped her in his coat, the garment so large it enveloped her completely. "Are you afraid?" he asked as they lay in the narrow bed, careful not to touch. "A little," Dorothy admitted, "but not of you." "What then?" Dorothy considered the question. "I'm afraid of disappointing you. I'm afraid of not being what you need. I'm afraid that one day you'll realize you made a mistake." Thomas was quiet for so long that Dorothy thought he had fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of the same things, afraid that I'll hurt you without meaning to, afraid that I'll fail you the way I failed them, afraid that you'll see who I really am and run." Dorothy turned onto her side, studying his profile in the moonlight that filtered through the hotel window. "Then I suppose we'll just have to prove each other wrong," she said. Thomas turned to look at her, and in the dim light, Dorothy saw him smile. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. "I suppose we will," he agreed. The journey back to the cabin the next morning felt different than their trip down the mountain. This time, Dorothy wasn't a refugee seeking shelter. She was a wife coming home. The word felt strange in her mind, but not unpleasant. As they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, Thomas stopped and turned to her. "It's not much," he said, and Dorothy could hear the uncertainty in his voice. She looked at the small log structure nestled among the pines, smoke rising from its chimney in a welcoming curl. It was simple and rustic, nothing like the grand houses she had sometimes dreamed of, but it was solid and well-built, crafted with obvious care and attention to detail. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The first weeks of marriage were an exercise in careful politeness. Thomas and Dorothy circled each other like cautious animals, each trying to anticipate the other's needs without overstepping invisible boundaries. Thomas continued to sleep on the floor, despite Dorothy's gentle protests. Dorothy took over the cooking and cleaning, trying to make herself useful while learning the rhythms of her new life. Slowly, gradually, they began to find their way to something that resembled companionship. Thomas taught Dorothy about the mountains, showing her which plants were edible, which tracks belonged to which animals, how to read the weather and the color of the sky. Dorothy introduced Thomas to the pleasure of having someone to talk to, drawing him into conversations about books and ideas that he had been starving for without realizing it. It was during one of these conversations, about a month after their wedding, that Dorothy finally understood the depth of Thomas's isolation. "I used to talk to myself," he admitted as they sat by the fire one evening. "Out loud, I mean. Sometimes I'd have whole conversations with people who weren't there. Started to worry I was losing my mind." "You were lonely," Dorothy said simply. "There's nothing wrong with your mind." "Isn't there?" Thomas looked at her with an expression that was almost pleading. "Sometimes I still hear their voices. My wife, my daughter. Sometimes I dream they're still alive. And when I wake up," he trailed off, unable to finish. Dorothy set down her mending and moved to sit beside him on the rough wooden bench he had built. "Tell me about them," she said gently. Thomas stiffened. "Dorothy, I don't think, please. I want to know about the people who made you who you are." For a moment, Dorothy thought he would refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "Her name was Mary. She was small, like you, but with red hair that caught fire in the sunlight. She laughed at everything, even my terrible jokes. Even when times were hard, she could find something to smile about." His voice grew softer, more distant. "And Emma, our little girl, she was only 4 when she had Mary's hair and my eyes. Used to follow me around the house, chattering about everything she saw. Called me her big Papa Bear." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes at the love in Thomas's voice, the pain that was still so raw even after 15 years. "They sound wonderful," she said. "They were. Mary was pregnant again when it happened. We were going to have another baby." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "I was working a claim about 10 miles from town. Came home to find everything gone. The neighbors said the fire started in the kitchen, spread too fast for them to get out. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I should have been there," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "If I hadn't been so focused on making money, on providing for them, maybe I would have been home. Maybe I could have saved them." Dorothy reached out and covered his clenched fist with her small hands. "Or maybe you would have died with them," she said quietly. "And then their deaths would have been meaningless, because no one would be left to remember them. To honor their memory." Thomas looked at her with surprise, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "You think remembering them honors them?" "I think living honors them. I think finding happiness again, if you can, honors them. I think they would want you to be more than just a monument to grief. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Mary used to say that love wasn't something you used up, that the more you gave away, the more you had. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Thomas turned to look at Dorothy, and she was surprised by the intensity in his gaze. She would have liked you, I think. I hope so, Dorothy said softly. I hope she would understand why I'm here. Why are you here, Dorothy? Really? It was Dorothy's turn to be quiet, to search for words that would capture the complexity of her feelings. At first it was desperation, she admitted. I needed help, and you were the only one who offered it. But now. She paused, trying to articulate something she was only beginning to understand herself. Now I think I'm here because this is where I belong. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. Spring came to the mountains with a rush of melting snow and blooming wildflowers. Dorothy had never experienced anything like it, the way the entire landscape seemed to come alive after the long winter. Thomas showed her hidden meadows carpeted with lupines and Indian paintbrush, secret waterfalls that thundered with snowmelt, valleys where deer grazed in the early morning light. It was during one of these expeditions that Dorothy finally saw Thomas truly smile. Not just the careful, guarded expressions he usually wore, but a genuine grin of pure joy as he watched her reaction to a family of bear cubs playing in a clearing. They're so beautiful, Dorothy breathed, careful to keep her voice low so as not to startle the animals. Their mother's probably nearby, Thomas warned, but his tone was gentle, indulgent. Are you worried? Not with you here, Thomas said, and something in his voice made Dorothy look at him sharply. You make everything brighter somehow. It was the closest thing to a declaration of feeling that Thomas had ever made, and Dorothy felt her heart skip a beat. Do I? She asked softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the bear cubs, but his attention clearly focused on her. I'd forgotten what it felt like to share something beautiful with another person, to see wonder through someone else's eyes. Dorothy moved closer to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel safe, she said, to know that someone was looking out for me. Not because they wanted something from me, but because they cared. I do care, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. More than I thought I could again. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the bear cubs tumble and play, while their massive mother kept a watchful eye from the edge of the clearing. Dorothy was acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her, of the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Thomas, she said finally, not sure what she wanted to say but knowing she needed to say something. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Thomas didn't automatically make his bed on the floor. Instead, he hesitated by the side of the bed, looking at Dorothy with an expression of such vulnerable hope that it took her breath away. Would it be all right, he asked carefully, if I slept beside you? Just slept, he added quickly. I don't want to presume. Thomas, Dorothy interrupted gently. We're married. You don't have to ask permission to sleep in your own bed. I know, but I wanted you to be comfortable. I wanted you to have time to. Dorothy reached out and took his hand, marveling as always at the contrast between his size and his gentleness. I'm comfortable, she said simply. I trust you. Those 3 words seemed to break something loose in Thomas's chest. He sank down onto the edge of the bed as if his legs had given out, his massive frame shaking with emotion. You shouldn't, he said roughly. You don't know what I'm capable of. I know exactly what you're capable of, Dorothy said firmly. I've seen your strength, Thomas. I've also seen your control. I've seen how careful you are with everything fragile, how gentle you are with things that could break. She moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the tears gathering in his eyes. I've seen how you treat me like I'm made of spun glass, how you're more afraid of hurting me than I am of being hurt. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Thomas reached up and cupped her face in his massive hands, his touch feather-light despite the calluses and scars that marked his palms. I never thought I'd feel this again, he whispered. I never thought I'd want to. And now? Now I can't imagine my life without you in it. Summer brought a contentment to their mountain home that Dorothy had never experienced before. She and Thomas fell into an easy rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. Dorothy tended a garden that flourished in the mountain soil, while Thomas worked his claim and hunted for their table. In the evenings, they read together by the fire, or Thomas would play the harmonica he had carved himself while Dorothy mended their clothes. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Dorothy found herself happier than she had ever imagined possible. The change in their relationship was gradual but unmistakable. The careful politeness of their early marriage gave way to genuine affection, and then to something deeper. Thomas began to touch her more freely, a hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, fingers brushing hers as he handed her a cup of coffee. Dorothy found herself seeking out these small intimacies, standing close to him as they worked side by side, letting her hand linger on his arm when she spoke to him. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Dorothy finally found the courage to voice something that had been growing in her heart for weeks. "I love you," she said quietly, the words carried away on the evening breeze. Thomas went very still beside her, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Dorothy, I know you didn't ask for that," she continued, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I know this marriage was supposed to be practical, a solution to both our problems, but I can't help how I feel." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "How do you feel?" Dorothy took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I feel like I've found my home. Not just this place, but you. I feel like everything that happened before, all the pain and loss and fear, was just preparing me to appreciate this, to appreciate you. Even knowing what I am, what I've done." "You're a good man who's suffered terrible losses," Dorothy said firmly. "You're someone who spent 15 years punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. You're the gentlest person I've ever known, and the strongest, and the most honorable." Thomas was quiet for so long that Dorothy began to fear she had made a mistake, that her declaration had somehow damaged the fragile peace they had built together. Then he spoke, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it. "I love you too," he said. "I've been fighting it for months, telling myself it was too soon, that I didn't have the right, but I can't fight it anymore." Dorothy felt tears of joy spring to her eyes as Thomas reached for her hand, his massive fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. "I never thought I'd say those words again," he continued. "I never thought I'd want to. But you brought me back to life, Dorothy. You made me remember what it feels like to hope." That night their marriage became real in every sense of the word. Thomas made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, his massive hands gentle as butterfly wings as they explored her body. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window, Dorothy felt a completeness she had never known existed. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly, his arm tightening around her. "None," Dorothy said firmly. "You? Only that it took me so long to admit what I was feeling." Dorothy smiled against his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that always clung to his skin. "We had to find our way to each other," she said. "Some things can't be rushed." The first snow of their second winter together found Dorothy standing at the kitchen window, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly. The baby wasn't due until spring, but already she could feel the flutter of tiny movements, the promise of new life growing inside her. Thomas came up behind her, his arms encircling her waist, his large hands covering hers on her stomach. "Thinking about anything in particular?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Just about how much has changed," Dorothy said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to hope for. And now?" Dorothy turned in his arms, looking up into the face that had become dearer to her than her own reflection. Thomas had trimmed his beard shorter over the summer, and she could see more of his features now, the strong jaw and the laugh lines that had appeared around his eyes. "Now I have everything I never knew I wanted," she said simply. Thomas bent to kiss her, his lips soft and warm against hers. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I used to think love was something that happened to you once, if you were lucky," he said. "I thought I'd used up my share. And now? Now I think love is something that grows, something that changes and deepens, and becomes something new with each person who shares it with you." Dorothy smiled, thinking of the child growing inside her, of the family they were creating together. Mary was right, she said. Love isn't something you use up. The more you give away, the more you have. Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She would have loved you, he said. She would have loved seeing you here, making this place a home again. I hope so, Dorothy said. I hope she knows that I'm not trying to replace what you had with her. I'm just trying to build something new alongside it. You're not replacing anything, Thomas said firmly. You're adding to it. You're making me whole again in a way I thought was impossible. As if summoned by their conversation, the baby chose that moment to kick, a strong flutter that made Dorothy gasp and laugh at the same time. Did you feel that? She asked, pressing Thomas's hand more firmly against her belly. Thomas's eyes went wide with wonder as he felt the movement of his child, the tangible proof of the new life they had created together. Hello, little one, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Your mama and I have been waiting to meet you. Dorothy watched the play of emotions across Thomas's face, the joy and wonder and fierce protectiveness that she knew would make him an extraordinary father. This child would never doubt that it was loved, never question its place in the world. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white. But inside, by the warmth of their fire, Dorothy and Thomas held each other close and planned for the future they were building together, one day at a time. Nobody in town had wanted to marry the mountain man. They had seen only his size, his wildness, his isolation, and had judged him unfit for civilized company. But Dorothy had looked deeper, past the surface to the gentle heart that beat beneath his massive chest. She had seen the man who read poetry by firelight, who carved toys for the children he had lost, who treated every living thing with reverence and care. In saving her from those men in the forest, Thomas had given Dorothy more than just physical protection. He had given her a chance at a life she had never dared to dream of, a love that was deeper and truer than anything she had thought possible. And in accepting his proposal, in choosing to see past the stories and rumors to the truth underneath, Dorothy had given Thomas something equally precious: the courage to love again, to hope again, to believe that he deserved happiness despite the tragedies of his past. Together, they had built something beautiful in their mountain sanctuary, a love that was tested by hardship and strengthened by understanding. They had proven that sometimes the most unlikely matches are the most perfect ones, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that the gentlest hearts often beat inside the strongest chests. As the snow fell around their cabin and their child stirred in Dorothy's womb, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mountain man had found his heart's desire, and she had discovered that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the very last thing you thought you wanted.